Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going on a journey. We're going to explore the depths of your
Ooh,
lungs.
that sounds exciting.
I know, right? Specifically, how we measure their capacity.
Okay.
So you sent in some really fascinating notes from Dr. Rasha Eldeeb on pulmonary volumes and capacities.
Ah,
And
yes.
let me tell you, I am already intrigued. We're going to uncover some pretty surprising facts about how much air your lungs can actually hold, like what those numbers tell us about your health.
Right.
Maybe even bust a few myths about breathing along the way.
I am so excited to unpack these concepts with you.
Yeah.
And yeah, explore how they all relate to the bigger picture of pulmonary health.
Okay, let's jump in. Dr. LD's notes mention this device. It's called a spirometer.
Okay.
It sounds kind of like straight out of a sci-fi movie, you know?
Haha.
But from what I understand, it basically records your lung volumes, giving us a visual representation of how well your lungs are working.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. It's not just about the numbers. It's about gaining insights into, that whole dynamic process of breathing.
Right.
And a really key concept here is the resting expiratory level.
Okay.
This is our baseline for all spirometry measurements. It's the amount of air left in your lungs after a normal exhale.
Okay.
We call this functional residual capacity,
Catchy.
or FRC, which is typically around 2.3 liters.
2.3 liters. Whoa, that's like carrying around a couple of soda bottles worth of air even after you exhale.
Yeah.
That's wild. But Dr. Eldeeb's notes also delve into something called static lung volumes.
Okay.
I have to admit, the term sounds a bit intimidating.
Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Think of lung volumes as like the basic building blocks of lung capacity. We have tidal volume, which is the amount of air you breathe in and out during normal, relaxed breathing.
Gotcha.
It's around 500 milliliters
Yeah.
for the average adult.
Okay, so that's our everyday breathing. What about when we take a really deep breath, like before diving into a pool?
That's where inspiratory reserve volume comes in. It's
Mhm.
that extra air that you can forcefully inhale after a normal breath. So that adds about 3,000 milliliters on top of your tidal volume.
So it's like our lungs have this hidden reserve tank.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's cool. And what about when we blow out all the candles on a birthday cake?
That's tapping into your expiratory reserve volume, which is the maximum amount of air you can forcefully exhale after a normal breath. And that adds another 1,100 milliliters to the mix.
Got it. So inhale reserve, exhale reserve. Okay, it's starting to make sense.
It is.
But there's one more volume that seems a bit mysterious. Residual volume?
Yeah.
What's that all about?
So residual volume is the air that remains in your lungs even after the most forceful exhalation.
Hmm.
So we're talking about 1,200 milliliters that you can't even expel.
But wait, so there's always some air hanging out in my lungs. Why is that?
That's a great question. Residual volume is really crucial because it makes sure there's always some air in your lungs to allow for continuous gas exchange. Imagine if your lungs completely emptied with every breath. Like the fluctuations in oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in your blood would be pretty dramatic. So residual volume acts like this buffer. It keeps things stable.
So it's like a built-in safety mechanism.
Yeah.
Ensures a smooth transition between breaths. That's pretty clever. But how do we even measure this residual volume if we can't exhale it?
We use a technique called the helium dilution method. It involves breathing in a known concentration of helium and then measuring how much that concentration is diluted by the air already in your lungs. It's a bit like adding a drop of food coloring to a glass of water.
Yeah,
The more water there is, the fainter the color becomes.
that's pretty ingenious.
Mhm.
It seems like our lungs are full of surprises.
They are.
But now I'm curious about these static lung capacities Dr. Eldeeb mentioned. Are these super volumes or?
You could think of them that way. Lung capacities are combinations of those individual volumes that we just discussed. They give us a broader picture of lung function. For example, inspiratory capacity is the total amount of air you can inhale after a normal exhale.
Okay.
It's your tidal volume plus your inspiratory reserve volume, which would be about 3,500 milliliters.
Okay, so we're adding those volumes together.
Right.
What about functional residual capacity? We talked about that earlier.
Yes. FRC is the air left in your lungs after a normal exhale. So it's your expiratory reserve volume plus that crucial residual volume.
Right.
And that adds up to 2,300 milliliters.
And then there's vital capacity, the one that sounds like a superhero.
Vital capacity, or VC, is the maximum amount of air you can exhale after taking the deepest breath possible. It's like your lungs, like a personal best. To calculate it, we add up your inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume,
Okay.
which comes out to about 4,600 milliliters.
So if someone has like a large vital capacity, does that mean they have stronger lungs?
It's not necessarily about strength, but it does reflect the overall capacity and efficiency of your lungs. A higher VC generally means you can take in more oxygen, which can be beneficial for like physical activities like running or swimming.
That makes sense. Athletes probably have higher VCs than the average person then, right?
Absolutely. Athletes, especially those in endurance sports, they often have larger lung volumes and capacities because their training demands greater oxygen uptake.
Of course.
But other factors can affect VC too, like age, gender, even body size.
So it's not just about hitting the gym. Genetics and lifestyle play a role too.
For sure.
But what about people with lung conditions? Does their vital capacity take a hit?
Unfortunately, yes. A reduced vital capacity can be a sign of various health issues.
Okay.
Conditions like asthma, COPD, even heart failure can affect how much air your lungs can hold and how well they function.
So vital capacity really is a vital indicator of overall health.
It is.
It's incredible how much we can learn from just a few breaths.
Truly, it's a window into our well-being.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on to the more dynamic aspects of lung function,
Okay.
there's one last static capacity to discuss: total lung capacity. As the name suggests, it's the total amount of air your lungs can hold after a maximum inhalation.
Right.
We get this by adding vital capacity and residual volume, which brings us to about 5,800 milliliters for an average adult male.
Okay, so we've got the volumes, and now we see how they all fit together to create these broader capacities. It's like putting together a puzzle.
Yeah.
But I'm noticing a theme here. We keep bumping up against this residual volume. You mentioned that spirometry can't measure it directly, right?
That's right.
Does that mean there are like limitations to what we can learn from these tests?
That's a sharp observation. You're right. Spirometry can't directly measure residual volume. That means any lung capacity that includes it, like functional residual capacity and total lung capacity, those can only be calculated, not directly measured.
So there's always a bit of a mystery lurking in those lungs.
Yeah, always a little bit of mystery.
I like it. But I'm ready to move beyond these static measurements and see how things work in action. Dr. Eldeeb's notes mention dynamic lung function tests.
Yes.
Which those sound a lot more exciting.
Yeah.
What's the difference between static and dynamic tests?
It's all about time. So static measurements are like taking a snapshot of your lungs at a specific moment.
Okay.
Dynamic tests, on the other hand, look at how your lungs perform over time. So assessing how quickly and efficiently you can move air in and out. Think of it like measuring your lungs' performance on an obstacle course.
Okay, challenge accepted. What kind of tests are we talking about? I see respiratory minute volume and effective ventilation volume.
Those are great starting points. Respiratory minute volume, sometimes called pulmonary ventilation, measures how much air you breathe in and out per minute during normal breathing. We calculate it by multiplying your tidal volume by your respiratory rate, which is typically around 6 to 8 liters per minute for an average adult.
So it factors in how often we breathe, too. What about effective ventilation volume? Is that similar?
Effective ventilation volume, or alveolar ventilation, gets a bit more specific. It focuses on the air that actually reaches your alveoli, so those tiny air sacs where gas exchange takes place. We have to subtract the air that stays in the conducting airways, what we call dead space volume, from the tidal volume, and then multiply that by the respiratory rate. And this typically works out to be about 4.2 to 5.6 liters per minute.
Dead space volume. That sounds a bit ominous. What exactly is that?
Think of it like the air in your trachea and bronchi. It's necessary for transporting air to the alveoli, but it doesn't actually participate in the gas exchange process. It's like the hallway leading to a room. Important for access, but not where the action happens.
Ah, so it's more like the delivery system than the package itself.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Interesting. But what about when we really push our lungs to the limit? Dr. Eldeeb mentions maximal breathing capacity, which sounds pretty intense.
That's when we measure your lungs' full potential. Maximal breathing capacity, or MBC, tells us the maximum amount of air you can move in and out in 1 minute when you're breathing as deeply and as rapidly as possible.
So how do they measure that? Do you have to breathe like a crazy person for a whole minute?
We don't want anyone passing out. So to avoid fatigue and dizziness, we usually have you breathe as hard and fast as possible for just 15 seconds. And then we use that data to estimate your MBC for a full minute.
That's a clever workaround. So what kind of numbers are we talking about for this lung power test?
For a typical adult male, MBC can range from 80 to 160 liters per minute,
Wow.
while women usually have slightly lower values, between 60 and 120 liters per minute.
Okay.
As with vital capacity, a higher MBC usually reflects better physical fitness and lung health.
So if I wanted to improve my lung capacity, I could hit the gym or maybe try some breathing exercises.
You're on the right track.
Yeah.
Regular exercise can definitely improve your lung capacity and efficiency. And there's growing evidence that targeted breathing exercises like diaphragmatic breathing or pursed lip breathing can also be beneficial, especially for people with certain lung conditions.
That's great to know. But even with all these measurements, I'm guessing there's a point where even the fittest person starts to feel the strain.
Right.
Is there a way to measure that?
That's where the dysmic index, or DI, comes in. It essentially tells us how much breathing reserve you have left. So how much your breathing capacity exceeds your normal resting breathing.
Hmm.
A DI above 90% is considered normal, meaning you have plenty of room to spare. Gotcha.
But if it drops below 70%, that's a sign you might be experiencing dyspnea or shortness of breath.
So it's like a gauge for how hard your lungs are working.
Mhm.
This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
But we haven't even touched on forced vital capacity and forced expiratory volume in the first second.
I know.
Are we about to get even more technical?
Yeah, we are, but trust me, it's worth it. Forced vital capacity, or FVC, is similar to the regular vital capacity we discussed earlier. But this time, we ask you to exhale as forcefully and rapidly as possible after a deep breath. It helps us see how quickly you can empty your lungs.
Okay, so it's like a time trial for exhaling.
Yes.
And what about forced expiratory volume in the first second?
That's FEV1 for short. And it's crucial measurement because it tells us how much air you can forcefully exhale in just the first second of that FVC test. We express it as a percentage of your total FVC. So in a healthy adult, you should be able to exhale about 83% of your FVC within that first second.
So if you have a low FEV1, that's not a good sign. It can be a red flag, especially if the ratio between your FEV1 and FVC is low. This ratio is incredibly useful for distinguishing between two major types of lung disorders, obstructive and restrictive.
Wait, back up. Obstructive versus restrictive. What's the difference?
Think of it this way. Obstructive lung diseases, like asthma or COPD, they make it difficult to exhale air because the airways are narrowed or obstructed. It's like trying to blow air out of a straw with a kink in it. So the airflow is restricted, so your FEV1 will be significantly reduced, even if your total FVC is relatively normal.
So it's like a bottleneck effect.
Exactly.
What about restrictive lung diseases? Do they show up differently?
Yes, with restrictive lung diseases like pulmonary fibrosis, the problem is that the lungs can't fully expand.
Okay.
It's like trying to inflate a balloon that's too stiff. This reduces both your FVC and FEV1, but the ratio between them might stay normal or even increase.
So the ratio is key. It's
Yeah.
like a detective clue, helping us figure out what's going on in the lungs.
Yeah.
This is amazing. We've uncovered so much about our lungs already, from the basic volumes to the dynamic forces that drive each breath. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a quick break and come back to explore even more fascinating insights into pulmonary function.
Sounds like a plan. I'm looking forward to diving even deeper with you in part 2. Welcome back to our deep dive into the fascinating world of pulmonary function.
I'm ready for round 2. In part 1, we covered those fundamental lung volumes and capacities.
Yes.
And even uncovered the secret world of airway resistance, like those tiny forces that can make breathing feel like a breeze or like a battle.
Exactly. And one of the most revealing ways to assess how your lungs perform under pressure is through a test called forced vital capacity, or FVC.
Right. We touched on that briefly before the break.
Yes.
It's like the supercharged version of vital capacity where you exhale as forcefully and rapidly as possible. Makes me think of those contests where people try to blow up balloons until they burst.
That's a great analogy. And what makes FVC so valuable is that it gives us a dynamic picture of your lung function. It's like putting your lungs through a stress test to see how they respond.
Okay, so what are we looking for in this stress test? What kind of clues does FVC reveal?
One of the key things we analyze is the shape of the exhalation curve. Imagine plotting the airflow coming out of your lungs over time during that forceful exhale. In a healthy individual, the curve should be nice and smooth, showing a rapid rise in airflow followed by a gradual decline as the lungs empty.
Okay, so a smooth curve is a good sign. But what if the curve looks a little, well, less smooth?
That's where things get interesting. If the curve shows a delayed peak or a flattened shape, it could indicate an obstructive lung problem like asthma or COPD. Remember, obstructive disorders make it harder to exhale air, so the airflow might be restricted, especially in the early part of the exhale.
So it's like trying to squeeze a lot of toothpaste out of a tube with a tiny opening. The flow is going to be slower and less smooth.
Precisely. And then we have restrictive lung problems, which show up differently on the FCC curve.
Right. Restrictive problems limit lung expansion, so I'm guessing the curve would look smaller overall.
You're exactly right. With restrictive disorders, the curve might look smaller overall, indicating a reduced lung capacity,
Okay.
but the shape might be relatively normal. The total amount of air you can exhale is reduced, but the airflow itself might not be as obstructed.
So it's like having a smaller tube of toothpaste, but the opening is still a normal size.
Yes,
You can get the toothpaste out, but there's just not as much of it.
that's a great way to visualize it. And
Yeah.
this is where forced expiratory volume in the first second, or FEV1,
Yeah.
comes into play.
Right. FEV1, that quick burst of air you exhale in the first second of the FEC test.
Huh?
We learned earlier that a healthy person can usually exhale about 83% of their FVC in that initial burst. But what happens if that number is lower? Does that always mean something is wrong?
A lower FEV1 doesn't always mean trouble, but it can be a sign of an obstructive lung problem. Think back to that kinked straw analogy. If your airways are narrowed, it takes longer to exhale a given volume of air, so that first second burst will be smaller.
So FEV1 is a measure of how quickly you can overcome that airway resistance. It's like a sprint for your lungs.
Exactly. And by comparing FEV1 to FEC, we get that all-important FEV1 FEC ratio, which helps us differentiate between those obstructive and restrictive lung issues. A low ratio, typically less than 70%, is a hallmark of obstructive disorders. On the other hand, a normal or even high ratio might suggest a restrictive problem.
It's amazing how much information we can get from just a few breaths, but Dr. Eldeeb's notes also mention these flow volume loops, which sound a bit more visual. Can you walk us through those?
Imagine taking that FEC curve we were just talking about and flipping it on its side.
Okay.
Now imagine doing the same thing for a forced inhalation. Put those two curves together and you get a flow volume loop, a visual representation of airflow throughout an entire forced breathing cycle, both inhalation and exhalation.
Okay, I'm picturing this loop-de-loop on a graph with airflow on one axis and lung volume on the other. But what kind of secrets can these loops reveal that we wouldn't see with just the numbers alone?
Flow volume loops are like fingerprints for your breath. They can highlight subtle patterns that might not be obvious from single-point measurements. For example, a scooped-out appearance on the exhalation curve, kind of like a dent in the loop, can suggest an obstructive problem. This tells us that airflow is restricted, especially when your lungs are closer to empty.
So if the loop looks like it's been taking bites out of an apple, that could be a sign of trouble.
That's a great way to remember it. On the other hand, a narrowed loop, where both the inhalation and exhalation curves look pinched, might suggest a restrictive problem, meaning your lungs aren't expanding as much as they should.
So the shape of the loop can tell us a lot, but we've been focusing on the mechanics of breathing, the volumes, the speeds, the shapes of those curves. What about the effort it takes to breathe? Dr. Eldeeb's notes mention the work of breathing, and I know from personal experience that sometimes breathing can feel like a real workout.
You're bringing up a really important point. We often take breathing for granted, but even at rest, it requires energy.
Right.
Every breath we take involves overcoming various forces of resistance, and that takes work.
So our respiratory muscles are constantly burning calories, even when we're just chilling on the couch.
Exactly. And the amount of work required can vary depending on factors like lung health, posture, and activity level. If you have a restrictive lung disease, for example, your lungs might be stiffer and harder to inflate, requiring more muscular effort to breathe.
That makes sense. It's like trying to inflate a pool float that's lost its elasticity. You have to put in way more effort.
That's a great analogy. And if you're exercising, your body's demand for oxygen increases. So your respiratory muscles have to work harder to bring in more air. It's like your muscles are saying, hey, lungs, we need more fuel.
So our lungs are like these tiny powerhouses constantly working to meet our body's demands. But how do we actually measure this work of breathing? Do we hook people up to tiny treadmills inside their lungs?
I wish it were that simple. One way to assess the work of breathing is by um, measuring the transpulmonary pressure. This is the difference in pressure between the inside of your alveoli and the pleural space, which is the space between your lungs and your chest wall.
Okay, so we're talking about the pressure gradient that drives air into our lungs, but how does that translate into a measure of work?
By analyzing the changes in transpulmonary pressure during inhalation and exhalation, we can calculate the work done by your respiratory muscles to um, overcome those resistive forces.
So it's like measuring how much force those muscles have to exert to pull air in and push it out. It's a real tug of war.
Precisely.
Mm.
And there are other techniques too, like measuring the electrical activity of the respiratory muscles, which can give us even more insight into how hard they're working.
So it's like we're eavesdropping on the communication between the brain and the respiratory muscles, listening in on their workout plan.
That's a great way to put it. And understanding the work of breathing is clinically important, especially for people with respiratory disorders. If someone is struggling to breathe, knowing how much work their respiratory muscles are doing can help us assess the severity of their condition and guide treatment decisions.
So it's not just a matter of curiosity.
No.
It can actually help us make informed decisions about patient care. That's pretty remarkable.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, we've been focusing on the lungs as this separate entity, but it's crucial to remember that they're just one part of a much larger system. Our breathing patterns are constantly influenced by signals from our brain, our muscles, even our emotions.
Right. We've been so focused on the lungs themselves that I almost forgot about the rest of the body.
Yeah.
How do all these other systems tie into the way we breathe?
Imagine you're walking down the street and suddenly you see a dog running towards you, barking. Even if it turns out to be friendly, your heart rate probably jumps. You might hold your breath for a second, and you feel a rush of adrenaline.
Definitely. That fight or flight response kicks in, even if it's just a false alarm. But what does that have to do with breathing?
Well, that's your sympathetic nervous system taking charge. It's the part of your nervous system that prepares your body for action. And one of the things it does is send signals to your respiratory system to increase your breathing rate and make your breath shallower, getting you ready to either fight or flee.
So even when we're not consciously thinking about it, our breathing is constantly adapting to our environment and our emotional state?
Exactly. And on the flip side, when we're relaxed and calm, our parasympathetic nervous system takes over. This is the rest and digest system, and it promotes slower, deeper breathing, which can help us feel more grounded and peaceful.
So our breath can actually be a powerful tool for regulating our emotions.
Yes,
It's like having a built-in calming mechanism.
precisely. And here's another fascinating connection. Our breathing patterns can directly influence our heart rate. It's a phenomenon called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and it's perfectly normal.
Respiratory sinus arrhythmia, that sounds complicated.
It's simpler than it sounds. It just means that your heart rate speeds up slightly when you inhale and slows down slightly when you exhale. It's all thanks to those intricate connections between our autonomic nervous system, our heart, and our lungs.
So it's like our breath is conducting a subtle rhythm for our heart to follow. That's amazing. It makes you realize how interconnected everything really is.
Absolutely. And this connection between breath and heart rate is just one example of how our respiratory system is woven into the fabric of our entire being. From our brain to our muscles to our emotions, everything is linked in this beautiful web of interdependence.
This is also fascinating. We've gone from exploring the basic building blocks of lung capacity to uncovering this intricate dance between our lungs and the rest of our body.
Yeah.
It really makes you appreciate the complexity and resilience of the human system.
It truly is a remarkable system, but as with all complex systems, things can sometimes go wrong. In part 3, we'll explore some of the factors that can disrupt this delicate balance, from aging and lifestyle choices to specific lung diseases and conditions. Join us as we delve into the challenges our respiratory system faces and how we can help it stay healthy and strong.
I can't wait to unpack that. See you soon for the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back, deep divers. We are in the final stretch of our exploration into the amazing world of your lungs. I'm excited to wrap up this journey with you. We've covered so much ground, from the fundamentals of lung volumes and capacities to the intricate ways our respiratory system interacts with the rest of our body.
Yeah, it's been an incredible journey. But before we emerge from the depths of our lungs,
Hey.
there's one more fascinating aspect I'm curious to explore. In part two, we touched on how our breathing can be affected by, factors like stress, exercise, even our emotions.
Right.
But what about those changes that happen more gradually over time? I'm thinking specifically about aging. How does getting older affect our lung function?
That's a great question. Aging is a natural process that affects all of our organs,
Right.
and our lungs are no exception. As we get older, several changes occur that can impact our respiratory system.
Okay, let's break it down. What are some of the key changes that happen in our lungs as we age?
One of the most significant changes is a decrease in lung elasticity. You remember those elastic fibers we talked about
Yeah.
earlier? They play a crucial role in helping our lungs expand and contract efficiently. But over time, those fibers can become less flexible, making our lungs feel a bit stiffer and less compliant.
Because it's like a rubber band that's lost some of its stretchiness.
Yes,
You have to pull harder to get the same result.
that's a perfect analogy. And this loss of elasticity can make it harder to um, take deep breaths and can also reduce our overall lung capacity.
That makes sense. I've noticed that as I've gotten older, I don't seem to have quite the same lung power as I did, in my younger years. Are there other changes besides elasticity that we should be aware of?
Absolutely. Another common age-related change is a weakening of the respiratory muscles.
Mm.
Just like other muscles in our body, our diaphragm and intercostal muscles, the ones responsible for breathing, can lose strength and endurance over time.
So even if our lungs are in like decent shape, those muscles might not be as powerful as they used to be.
Exactly. And this can make it more challenging to breathe deeply and efficiently, especially during physical activity. You might feel winded more easily and need to take more frequent breaks.
Okay, so we've got a decrease in elasticity and a weakening of the respiratory muscles. Is there anything else we should add to this list?
Another interesting change that happens with aging is an increase in something called airway closure. Remember those bronchioles?
Uh-huh.
Those tiny airways that branch throughout our lungs. As we get older, those airways become more prone to collapsing during exhalation, especially in the lower parts of the lungs.
Wait, so our airways can actually collapse. That sounds kind of scary.
It's not as alarming as it sounds. It's actually a normal physiological phenomenon, and it happens to everyone to some extent.
Yeah.
But as we age, it can become more pronounced.
So why does this happen? What makes those airways more likely to close off as we get older?
Part of it has to do with that decrease in lung elasticity we were talking about. If the lungs are less elastic, they can't exert as much outward pressure to keep those airways open,
Yeah.
especially during exhalation when the chest cavity is shrinking.
So it's like the support structure around those airways isn't as strong as it used to be.
Exactly. And this can lead to air trapping, where some air gets stuck in the alveoli because those airways have closed off before it could be exhaled.
So it's like those tiny air sacs become little pockets of stale air. Is that a problem?
It can be. If too much air gets trapped in the alveoli, it can reduce the efficiency of gas exchange, making it harder for our body to get the oxygen it needs and get rid of carbon dioxide.
This is all starting to paint a pretty clear picture of, why breathing can become more challenging as we age. We've got those stiffer lungs, weaker muscles, and those collapsing airways, like a triple whammy.
Got it. But it's important to remember that these changes happen gradually over time. And there's a lot we can do to slow down the process and maintain healthy lung function as we age.
Okay, that's encouraging. So what are some things we can do to keep our lungs in tip-top shape as we get older?
One of the most effective things we can do is stay active. Regular exercise helps strengthen our respiratory muscles. It improves lung capacity and keeps our airways clear. It's like a tune-up for our entire respiratory system.
So even moderate exercise like brisk walking or swimming can make a difference.
Absolutely. Even short bursts of activity throughout the day can be beneficial. The key is to find activities you enjoy and make them a regular part of your routine.
Got it. Stay active. Check. What else can we do to support our lung health?
Another important step is to avoid smoking and exposure to secondhand smoke. We all know smoking is bad for our health, but it's especially damaging to our lungs. Smoking destroys those precious elastic fibers, weakens the respiratory muscles, and increases the risk of lung cancer and other respiratory diseases.
So if you're a smoker, quitting is probably the best gift you can give your lungs.
Absolutely. And even if you don't smoke, minimizing your exposure to secondhand smoke is crucial.
Okay, smoking is out. What else should we be mindful of?
Paying attention to air quality is also important. Air pollution, both indoors and outdoors, can irritate our lungs and contribute to respiratory problems.
So things like dust, mold, pollen, they can all take a toll on our lungs.
Exactly. If you have allergies or sensitivities, taking steps to minimize your exposure to those triggers can make a big difference. And if you live in an area with a high air pollution, checking air quality reports and limiting your outdoor activity on bad air days can help protect your lungs.
These are all great tips. It seems like taking care of our lungs is a multifaceted approach. It's about staying active, avoiding harmful substances, and being mindful of our environment. Is there anything else we can add to our lung health toolkit?
One more thing I'd add is the power of conscious breathing.
Okay.
Taking a few moments each day to practice deep, slow breaths can help relax our respiratory muscles, improve lung capacity, and even reduce stress and anxiety.
So even something as simple as taking a few deep breaths can make a difference.
Absolutely. It's like a mini massage for your lungs. Techniques like diaphragmatic breathing, where you focus on expanding your belly as you inhale, can be particularly beneficial.
This deep dive has been such an eye-opening experience. We started with those basic building blocks of lung capacity and ended up uncovering this intricate web of connections that extends throughout our entire body and our environment. It's truly remarkable.
It is. And what's even more remarkable is that we have the power to influence our lung health through our choices and our actions. By taking care of our lungs, we're taking care of our overall well-being.
I couldn't agree more. A big thank you to Dr. Rasha Eldeeb for sparking this incredible journey with her insightful notes. And to you, our amazing listeners, for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained a newfound appreciation for the incredible power and resilience of your lungs, and we encourage you to take a deep breath and savor the amazing gift of each breath you take.